Good afternoon. I am Kim Bogyong, a KFL lecturer at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Today I will talk about the recategorization of notes for interpreters in the Court Interpreter Handbook and the redefinition of the role of interpreters. This Court Interpreter Handbook is currently used as a training booklet for court interpreters in Korea. I will first explain why I chose this very topic. Currently, in Korea, there is no unified set of code of ethics or code of conduct. And against this backdrop, this Court Interpreter Handbook serves as a reference for norms and guidelines for court interpreters. Nevertheless, in terms of both content and structure, it needs reorganization and improvement. And while the interpreter's perception of their own roles and responsibilities is important, there is no clause in the handbook that deals with this topic. And it is causing much confusion among court interpreters in Korea. Therefore, in order to provide practical guidelines and boost the expertise of court interpreters, I believe there is a strong need to recategorize the notes for interpreters in the handbook and also specifically prescribe the role of court interpreters. Now, to give you a background on the Court Interpreter Handbook, it was first published by the National Court Administration in order to ensure accurate interpreting in court for cases that involve non-Korean speakers. It was first published in 7 languages in 2006, then in 16 languages in 2015, and 9 languages in 2020. But these 9 versions published in 2020 include revised editions, so the handbook is available in a total of 23 languages, including Japanese, Chinese, English, and also a wide range of minor languages. The handbook can be downloaded at the link on the slide, and the handbook in 23 languages can be downloaded without having to subscribe to the court's website. Now, let's look at the overall structure of the Court Interpreter Handbook. The first part includes notes for interpreters, and this will be the central focus of my talk today. Under Part 1, we can find Code of Ethics for court interpreters and also the method of court interpreting. In the following parts, we can find explanation on different types of legal procedures, legal background knowledge, legal vocabulary, and the frequently used text of judgment or court decision and its translation. Let's move on to look at the notes for interpreters. Part 1 is comprised of 3 sections, but it is difficult to infer the content of each section by only looking at the subtitles. Section 1 contains general notes for interpreters, and Section 2 includes how to prepare for the first hearing date, and Section 3 is simply titled Court Interpreting, so it's hard to guess what content it includes. But this third section is actually comprised of principles and method of court interpreting. So it is difficult to infer the content from looking at the subtitles, as I have mentioned. Now we'll take a look at the first section, the general notes for interpreters. The very first clause stipulates that interpreters should interpret sincerely according to their conscience. It is also included in the interpreter's oath. But the problem here is that the meaning of sincere interpreting is rather ambiguous. and it can be interpreted in many different ways. Looking at the explanation, it says the interpreter should interpret faithfully. And many readers assume that this means accuracy. But by looking at the context, this clause actually emphasizes professional fidelity rather than accuracy in interpreting. There is another clause that emphasizes the accuracy of interpreting. So this very clause actually refers to the professional attitude of court interpreters rather than accurate interpreting. Second clause is about fairness, and the third clause is about confidentiality. Three key principles when it comes to court interpreting are accuracy, fairness, and confidentiality, and there is a general consensus surrounding these key principles. The fourth clause stipulates that the interpreter should not provide services other than interpreting when engaging with people involved in the case or the families of the parties. So it's a prescription on the scope of the interpreter's role. And the fifth clause forbids interpreters from performing examination, disciplining, raising opinions, or making judgments. And it also states that all tongue slips, curse words, complaints, or seemingly unnecessary comments should be interpreted, and that all corrections of such mistakes should be made by the parties of the case or the judge. In fact, if you look at the latter part of the handbook, there is another clause that emphasizes the need to interpret verbatim. So this clause here is rather redundant. I believe that looking at the overall structure, the first part should only contain general principles, and such detailed prescription can be saved for the latter part of the handbook. The second section deals with how to prepare for the first hearing date. It lays out specifically how the interpreter should prepare for the assignment. First, interpreters should examine the indictment and other documents in advance, and in case they have any questions, they should reach out to the court secretary and clarify. If they don't have previous experience of court interpreting, they should attend other trials in order to be fully prepared. I believe such guidelines contain very useful content. The third section is titled Court Interpreting, and this part includes specific method of court interpreting. The first clause stipulates that the interpreter should interpret faithfully and interpret in direct speech. And here it is questionable whether faithful interpreting and interpreting in direct speech are the same thing. The following clauses includes countermeasures that the interpreters can leverage in problematic situations. There could be an instance where the interpreter fails to correctly understand the judge, the defendant, or the witness. And in such instance, the interpreter is advised to clarify through the judge. The third clause addresses a situation where the defendant or the witness misunderstands what the interpreter said, despite the interpreter having interpreted correctly. In such situation, the interpreter is advised to go ahead with interpreting and later on tell the judge that there seems to have been a miscommunication. And to me, it seems slightly off topic, but there is a rule here that states interpreters should have right to take a break after interpreting for a long period of time because it may compromise the accuracy of interpreting. I think it is out of place, and this clause simply reflects the train of thought of the writer of the handbook. The fourth clause highlights the importance of examining documents in advance, and it is redundant since we've already seen this element in the previous section. And the fifth clause highlights the importance of understanding the text of the judgment by studying the structure and the technical terms in advance. Rather than in section 3, I think such content should be addressed in a separate clause on its own, in my opinion. Now let's take a look at the role of interpreters as shown in the handbook. The key principle in court interpreting is to interpret verbatim what was said, so it prescribes a rather neutral role. Also, on page 8 of the handbook, it advises interpreters to refrain from engaging in examination, giving disciplines, or making judgments. So it seems the interpreter's role is strictly neutral. However, going beyond part 1, notes for interpreters, if we look at parts 2 to 5, the handbook actually calls on the interpreter to play a mediator role. For example, there are instances where the defendant misunderstands the demand of the prosecution as the final court decision, as the ruling of the judge. In such situation, the interpreter should explain to the defendant the difference between the demand of the prosecution and the final ruling. And it is not only a recommendation to do so, but it stipulates that it is a duty of the interpreter to do so. Also, in cases where the defendant is not familiar with the legal system of probation, the interpreter is advised to explain such legal system and the difference between probation and actual imprisonment to the defendant. So, it seems that the role of the interpreter is not only limited to interpreting, but they are asked to play the role of a mediator, and this adds much burden to court interpreters, and many legal professionals are actually against the idea of interpreters playing the role of a mediator. According to a study that conducted a survey among court interpreters who are currently active, their awareness or perception on the role of interpreters greatly diverged. Some thought they should play the role of a mediator, while others thought they should only do interpreting. So there is a need to clarify the role of court interpreters. I'd like to point out a number of shortcomings of the notes for interpreters in this court interpreter handbook. There is no clear distinction between the ethical aspects and the practical aspects, and between the general principles and specific guidelines. Also, they are laid out in no systematic order. So the key elements are not clearly conveyed to the reader. Also, items that belong in different sections are mixed in one section, and overall there is the problem of redundancy. I believe that significant elements can be highlighted more effectively through proper organization and categorization, rather than having to repeat them over and over again. And if we look closely at the notes for interpreters, there is a disproportionate focus on the duties of interpreters, and the handbook does not address the rights of interpreters. except for their right to break. However, I am doubtful whether interpreters are actually able to fully exercise their right to break at court. In reality, testimonies could last for only 5 or 10 minutes, or the defendant may simply not show up at court. Since there are many variables that are out of control at court, it is questionable whether interpreters can really demand to exercise their right to take a break. I believe that there needs to be specific clauses surrounding the rights of court interpreters in this handbook. But the handbook also has its merits. My students often ask me what measures that they can resort to when they cannot understand the speaker or when they have difficulties reproducing the message in the target language. While communication is difficult even when we are all speaking the same language, and in such cases, clarification and asking for rephrasing is often necessary. I believe that if this handbook specifically lays out countermeasures that allow clarification at court through the judge, it will greatly help court interpreters and facilitate their practice at court. So those were a number of shortcomings that I have noticed. And now I'll take a look at the nature of the Court Interpreter Handbook. It deals with both ethical aspects and also the practical aspects of court interpreting. It comprises macro-level principles to specific guidelines. From an ethical perspective, it can be seen as a set of ethical codes, regulations, and also as a code of conduct. From the more practical perspective, it can be seen as a code of conduct, guidelines, principles, or norms of court interpreting. Also, to further clarify, I would like to analyze the word code, which is 강령 in Korean. On the slide, you can see the Chinese characters that make up the Korean word for code. The first character, 강, means the wire of a fishnet, and the second character, 령, means collar. So if you pull on it, the rest follows, just like the general or basic principle. The Latin root word for the English word code is codex, and it means the stem of a tree. So the word code or 강령 used to refer to the basic ideology of a political or social group. But now, the word code is often used to lay out the central values of a specific organization. And the word is often used in phrases such as code of conduct or code of ethics. And they usually reflect the values upheld by the members of a certain organization. So when we say code, we often think of norms, method, or practical guideline. And there are 3 categories of codes, such as code of practice, code of ethics, and code of conduct. And this classification can be found in the 2021 Code of Conduct for Public Officials. But usually, code of ethics refers to the most fundamental principles. Then the code of conduct is a bit more specific, and the code of practice is at the most granular level. If you look at these 3 categories of codes, the difference is mainly in the level of granularity. And the code of ethics and code of conduct frequently overlaps, and the same goes for code of practice and the code of conduct. So it is very tricky to distinguish these categories apart from one another. Well, as cited in Hyang Lee's paper published in 2018, Wood and Rimmer states that code of ethics is rather the philosophical and fundamental principles, while the code of conduct refers to a practical guideline with specific prescriptions. So the notes for interpreters included in the Court Interpreter Handbook seems to be closer to a code of conduct. In Hyang Lee's proposal for a discourse on professional ethical codes for interpreters and translators published in 2018, we can find a variety of recommendations on how to approach this topic. And I think these can be applied to the notes for interpreters in the Court Interpreter Handbook. It advises that the code of conduct and code of ethics and the micro and macro aspects should be distinguished from one another. Going beyond the case of Korea, actually, when we try to find references in other countries for the norms, ethical codes, and code of conduct for court interpreters, in fact, there is no clear distinction among these different sets of norms. So I believe when organizing such codes, we could go from a general to more specific content, referring to the proposals of Hyang Lee. And this paper also suggests we could start with code of ethics, then move on to a code of conduct. Or we could also narrow down the scope from general interpreting and translation to subcategories such as legal interpreting and legal translation. The proposal also calls for a transdisciplinary and integrated approach when approaching the organization of the codes. Court interpreters are, in fact, experts of interpreting and experts of communication, but from a legal perspective, they are non-professionals when it comes to law. Therefore, the notes for interpreters should be put together through a collaborative effort of experts from both the legal and interpreting fields. Furthermore, the ethical codes should be reflected in the training of interpreters and translators. While judiciary interpreting may be an exception, when it comes to interpreting and translation in general, at least in the case of Korea, the education on code of ethics for interpreters is insufficient. And this is an area that needs improvement. So once such codes of ethics is established, it should be incorporated in the curriculum for interpreters. And now I would like to propose the following recategorization of the notes for interpreters to be included in the handbook. It moves from abstract content to more specific content. It starts with the code of conduct for court interpreters, including general principles, the scope of responsibilities and roles of interpreters, and the rights of interpreters. And the second part deals with the specific method of court interpreting, including general principles, countermeasures for problematic or difficult situations, and last but not least, how to prepare for court interpreting, but giving it less weight than in the previous or the current handbook. Going into further detail, when discussing the general principles in the Code of Conduct for court interpreters, faithfulness and fairness and confidentiality should all be included, but I believe there should be more focus on the professional attitude of court interpreters rather than accuracy. And one element that should be added is the importance of the effort of interpreters to maintain their interpreting capacity or interpreting skills. The second section under Part 1 will describe the scope of responsibilities and roles of the interpreter. And the third section of Part 1 should include the rights of interpreters. And along with their right to take a break, I believe there should be measures to ensure the safety of interpreters. While nowadays there are cases where interpreters join via virtual platforms, conventionally, court interpreters are expected to be present at court with defendants of criminal cases in a confined space. Therefore, there is a need to include safety measures for the protection of interpreters. The second part, dealing with principles and method of court interpreting, will comprise of 3 sections. The first section will include general principles, calling on the interpreter to interpret verbatim what was said faithfully. And the second section should include countermeasures for difficult situations, such as instances where the interpreter or the defendant or the witness fail to fully understand what has been said. But on top of such situations, there should be measures that deal with the time constraint at court. In fact, usually proceedings happen under a tight schedule, and often judges must run to their next hearings. So there is a rush at court. And according to a survey that was conducted, in reality, clarification through the judge rarely takes place, and interpreters just ask questions directly or interpret based on their own understanding. So I believe we need measures to be put in place to deal with such time constraint at court and how clarification can be made under such time pressure. Also, currently there is no clause that deals with misinterpreting, which occasionally happens at court. And there are often instances where the interpreter is late to realize such errors and is not able to correct such errors immediately. So measures to deal with such situations should also be added. And lastly, the third section can deal with how to prepare for a court interpreting assignment. And we can use the content that is currently published. In fact, the handbook is only 3 to 4 pages long, but it addresses a wide range of matters related to court interpreting, and it has areas for improvement. And also, in May of 2020, a revised edition of the Chinese version was issued. However, only minor corrections were made, and there was no change to the content, and there is still a lot of serious translation errors in this Chinese version, such as sentences where the subject and object are mixed up. Also, changes to the Criminal Procedure Act due to adjustments of investigative rights of the police and the prosecution are not reflected in the current version. The overall style of writing should be improved in tandem with the project to make statutes easier to understand. The style of writing should be improved so that everyone can easily understand the handbook. Also, when we suggest the method of court interpreting, there should be an explanation on the standards or principles that were considered when writing up this handbook. The current handbook does not have any preface that gives an explanation on such standards or principles. Court interpreters are often required to make judgments on the spot in order to convey the intended meaning. Word-by-word interpreting can be done with the help of a dictionary, but court interpreters need to have an overall and consistent understanding on the principles in order to make the right judgment when interpreting. So such content can be added in the preface of the handbook. I believe such improvements should be made through an overall restructuring and recategorizing of the handbook rather than just making minor additions here and there. This slide shows the list of references that I have used to prepare the presentation. And thank you for your attention.